moment the palace thought it could quietly rewrite the rules, everything changed. And what happened next did not just challenge authority, it exposed something far deeper about power, control, and the limits of a king's reach. Because when Prince Edward's legal team finally broke their silence, they did not simply defend an inheritance, they forced the monarchy itself to confront a question it never expected to answer. What happens when the crown's will collides with the Queen's final decision? And here is where it becomes impossible to ignore the tension that has been building beneath the surface for years. For decades, King Charles III believed that modernization meant control, that streamlining the monarchy gave him the authority to review, reshape, and even reclaim what earlier generations had quietly put in place. But what if that belief was never as absolute as it seemed? What if something had already been locked beyond his reach long before he ever took the throne? Because behind closed doors, long before the public ever heard a whisper of conflict, Queen Elizabeth II had already made her move. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the kind of precision that only comes from decades of understanding exactly how the institution works. She did not just pass down a title. She built a structure around it. A structure designed to last. A structure designed to resist interference. And most importantly, a structure designed to protect one specific person. Now ask yourself this: if a monarch carefully secures something in her final years, knowing the internal pressures that exist within her own family, was that simply tradition? Or was it preparation? Because when Edward stepped into the role of Duke of Edinburgh, it looked like a quiet transition, almost ceremonial, almost expected. But beneath that calm surface was something far more calculated. The title was never meant to stand alone. It was tied, legally, structurally, financially, to something much bigger: Bagshot Park. Not just a residence, not just a symbol, but a foundation. A base of power. A physical anchor that gave the title real weight inside the monarchy. And this is where the story begins to tighten. Because what the palace reportedly did not anticipate was how far Edward had already gone to secure that foundation. Years before any dispute emerged, he had invested his own private money, signed long-term agreements, extended leases, and built a legal position that was not symbolic, but concrete. This was not a royal relying on privilege. This was someone quietly preparing for a moment when that privilege might be challenged. So when the pressure finally came, when reviews began, when questions were raised, when the idea of restructuring started circling closer and closer, Edward was not reacting. He was ready. And that changes everything. Because now the question is no longer whether the king has authority. The question becomes, can that authority override something that was deliberately designed to resist it? Think about the implications of that for a second. If one royal family member can legally hold ground against the crown itself, what does that say about the balance of power inside the institution? What does that say about the limits of modernization when it collides with legacy decisions that were never meant to be undone? And just when you think the situation could not become more complex, another layer quietly enters the picture. One that is far more personal, far more symbolic, and far more dangerous in terms of public perception. Because this was never just about land or titles. It extended into something deeply emotional, something tied to identity, memory, and personal connection. Something that could not be reduced to legal language alone. At the center of that layer stands Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh. And what was questioned was not just ownership, but meaning. Because when something given as a personal gift, something tied to a wedding, to a moment, to a relationship, is suddenly reviewed, audited, or reclassified, it stops being administrative. It becomes personal. So let me ask you this: when does a review stop being about policy and start becoming about control? Because inside the palace, these lines are never clearly drawn. They blur. They shift. And sometimes, they are crossed without anyone realizing just how far things have gone until it is too late. And that is exactly what makes this moment so critical. Because what Edward's lawyers did was not just present documents. They forced clarity. They brought everything into the open. The agreements, the intent, the financial commitments, the recorded decisions. And once that happens, once everything is laid out in a way that cannot be quietly adjusted or reinterpreted, the entire dynamic changes. Now it is no longer about internal discussions. It is about record, about proof, about something that can no longer be reshaped behind closed doors. And here is where the tension reaches a level the monarchy rarely allows the public to see. Because if the king pushes forward, he risks undermining the very foundation of trust that gives his authority meaning. But if he steps back, he acknowledges that there are limits to that authority. Limits set not by opposition, but by his own mother's final decisions. So which matters more, control in the present or credibility built over generations? Because the answer to that question does not just affect one estate, one title, or one family member. It shapes how the monarchy itself is perceived, whether it is seen as stable, consistent, and bound by its own rules, or flexible, shifting, and willing to reinterpret those rules when it suits the moment. And as this situation unfolds, one thing becomes impossible to ignore. This is not just a dispute. It is a turning point. Because somewhere between legacy and modernization, between personal loyalty and institutional control, between what was given and what was believed could be taken back, a line has been drawn. And now the real question is, who actually decides where that line holds? And just when it seemed like the battle over inheritance had reached its peak, something far more unsettling began to unfold behind palace walls, because what started as a legal defense over land and title suddenly shifted into something deeply personal, something symbolic, and something that many insiders would later describe as the moment this quiet conflict turned into an undeniable power struggle. Because while Prince Edward was securing his position on paper, another move was already being set in motion. One that did not involve estates, leases, or financial records, but instead reached into something far more sensitive: identity, recognition, and personal dignity within the royal hierarchy. Earlier that same year, before the legal documents were ever placed on the table, a quiet visit reportedly took place under the authority of Queen Camilla, and it was presented in the most harmless way possible, described as a routine internal audit, a standard review of royal assets, something administrative, something procedural, something that should not have raised alarm. But here's where you need to pause and think carefully. When has anything inside the royal family ever been routine when it involves something deeply personal? Because the focus of that audit was not random, and it was not broad. It was precise. It was targeted. And at the center of it stood Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh. Now ask yourself this: why would an internal review suddenly turn its attention towards something that had been quietly accepted for decades? Because what was being examined was not just jewelry, but a specific piece with deep emotional and historical weight, something that had defined Sophie's public royal identity for years. And once that piece was brought into question, the implications went far beyond a single item, because it raised a dangerous precedent. If one personal gift could be reclassified, what stops others from being pulled back into the system? And this is exactly where the situation began to escalate. Because according to those familiar with the internal dynamics, the argument presented was framed through technical reasoning, suggesting that certain items, due to their historical origin, could be interpreted as part of the crown's broader collection rather than strictly private possessions. On the surface, that might sound logical, even reasonable. But look deeper, because when logic is used to reinterpret something personal, it often signals something much bigger is at play. So here's the question you should be asking yourself right now. Was this really about classification, or was it about control? Because if that interpretation were accepted, it would not just affect Sophie. It would ripple across the entire royal family. Gifts given over decades, moments tied to personal relationships, tokens of trust from Queen Elizabeth II herself, all of it could suddenly become subject to review, reassessment, and potentially reclamation. And that is where the risk becomes enormous. Because once you begin to question the personal decisions of a monarch who ruled for over 70 years, you are not just adjusting policy, you are rewriting history. Now think about what that means inside an institution built entirely on continuity and trust. Because if one generation begins to reinterpret the decisions of the previous one, where does it stop? And more importantly, who decides where that line is drawn? This is exactly why Edward's response was not delayed, not cautious, and certainly not passive. Because unlike many royal disputes that remain quietly buried, this one struck at something foundational. It was not just about defending property anymore. It was about protecting the integrity of what had been given, what had been promised, and what had been documented. And what his legal team produced in response was not just a counter-argument, but a complete shutdown of that narrative. Documents, signed records, clear classification, direct intent. Everything pointed back to one undeniable fact: this was not an institutional asset. This was a personal gift. A decision made directly, intentionally, and without ambiguity. And here is where the tension becomes almost impossible to ignore. Because once that clarity is established, the original move, the audit, the questioning, the attempt to reinterpret, begins to look very different. It no longer appears procedural. It appears strategic. So let me ask you something. When a system begins to test boundaries it has never tested before, is it exploring options? Or is it pushing limits to see what it can take? Because inside Buckingham Palace, these moments are rarely isolated. They are connected. They build on each other. And they often signal shifts that are much larger than they initially appear. And this is exactly why the conflict did not stay contained. Because once Edward pushed back, once the legal reality was placed on the table, once it became clear that this was not something that could be quietly adjusted, the situation began to evolve rapidly. Internal divisions started forming. Loyalties became more visible. And the quiet unity that the monarchy relies on began to show cracks. Now think about that carefully. Because the monarchy does not function on power alone. It functions on perception, on stability, on the belief that everything operates smoothly, even when it does not. So what happens when that perception begins to fracture from within? What happens when internal disagreements start to surface, not publicly, but strongly enough to influence decisions behind closed doors? And most importantly, what happens when those disagreements involve not just policy, but personal trust between members of the same family? Because at this stage, the conflict had already moved beyond documents and into something far more volatile. It had become personal. And once a conflict inside the royal family reaches that level, it rarely resolves quietly. Instead, it escalates. And just as tensions reached that breaking point, just as the legal arguments were solidified and the personal stakes became impossible to ignore, another figure stepped into the situation. Someone whose presence alone would change the balance of the entire conflict. Because this was no longer just about Edward, or Sophie, or even the king. This was about to become something much bigger. And what happened next would force the palace into a position it could not easily escape. So the question now is, when someone with both authority and independence decides to intervene, does it calm the situation? Or does it push everything even closer to the edge? And just when the situation seemed like it could not grow any more intense, the door opened. And everything inside that room shifted in a way that no legal document, no quiet negotiation, and no internal memo could ever achieve. Because the person who walked in did not come to discuss, she came to confront. Because when Princess Anne stepped into that private meeting with King Charles III, the entire tone of the conflict changed from controlled tension to something far more direct, far more dangerous, and far more revealing about what was really happening beneath the surface of the monarchy. Now think about this carefully. Why would Anne, someone known for discipline, restraint, and absolute loyalty to duty, decide to involve herself so decisively at this exact moment? Because this was not just about supporting her younger brother Prince Edward. This was about something much deeper, something that reached back to the final decisions of Queen Elizabeth II, and something Anne understood better than almost anyone else inside that family: the importance of a monarch's word. And here is where the tension sharpens. Because inside that room, there was no soft entry, no polite framing, no attempt to ease into the conversation. And reportedly went straight to the core issue, and what she raised was not emotional, it was structural. She questioned what happens to the authority of the crown itself if the signed decisions of a monarch can be revisited, reinterpreted, or quietly undone after they are gone. So let me ask you this: if the word of a queen who ruled for over 70 years can be challenged, what does that mean for the authority of the king who follows her? Because that question does not just sit inside a single meeting. It echoes through the entire system. And this is exactly why her intervention mattered. Because Anne was not arguing over property. She was defending continuity. She was protecting the idea that when a monarch makes a decision, especially one documented, witnessed, and executed, it must stand, not just for the sake of the individual involved, but for the credibility of the institution itself. Now imagine the weight of that moment. Because on one side sat a king trying to reshape a modern monarchy, and on the other stood a princess reminding him that the monarchy only works if its past decisions remain intact. And that creates a conflict that is almost impossible to resolve cleanly. Because if Charles pushes forward, he risks weakening the very system he is trying to control. But if he steps back, he acknowledges limits that no monarch wants to openly admit. So what matters more, control over the present or respect for the past? And just when you think that question alone would be enough to define the entire conflict, and reportedly took it one step further. Because she did not treat the issues separately. She connected everything. The estate, the inheritance, the personal gifts, the legal documents. All of it, in her view, pointed to a single pattern. A pattern where decisions made by the previous monarch were being tested, not individually, but collectively. Now ask yourself this: if multiple decisions begin to be questioned at the same time, is that coincidence? Or is that strategy? Because inside institutions like the monarchy, patterns matter far more than isolated events. And understood that. Which is why her position was not cautious. It was firm. She made it clear that if one decision is allowed to be challenged, it opens the door for others, and once that door is open, there is no easy way to close it again. Now think about the long-term impact of that. Because the monarchy is not just about power in the present. It is about trust across generations. It is about the belief that what is decided today will still hold tomorrow. So what happens when that belief starts to weaken? What happens when members of the same family begin to question whether the protections they rely on will still exist in the future? And this is where the situation becomes even more complex. Because Anne was not just speaking as a royal. She was speaking as someone who had watched the internal dynamics of the family for decades, someone who had seen how pressure builds, how decisions shift, and how individuals can quietly lose position over time without any formal announcement ever being made. So when she stepped in, she was not reacting to a single moment. She was responding to a pattern she recognized. And that changes everything. Because now the conflict is no longer about a single dispute. It becomes a test of direction. A test of whether the monarchy will remain anchored in the decisions of its past, or whether it will begin to reshape those decisions under the pressure of modernization and control. And here is where the pressure inside the palace begins to intensify. Because once Anne made her position clear, the room was no longer balanced. This was no longer a discussion between perspectives. It became a confrontation between principles. And that kind of confrontation does not end quickly. It forces decisions. It forces lines to be drawn. It forces people to choose sides, even if those choices are never made publicly. So let me ask you something. When a system that depends on unity begins to divide internally, even quietly, how long can that unity really hold? Because the reality is, once those divisions begin, they rarely disappear. They evolve. They deepen. They reshape how decisions are made moving forward. And that is exactly what makes this moment so critical. Because from this point on, nothing inside the monarchy can return to exactly how it was before. The trust has been tested. The boundaries have been pushed. And the lines, whether visible or not, have been drawn. And as Anne walked out of that room, leaving behind a king forced to weigh authority against legacy, one thing had become undeniably clear. This was no longer just Edward's fight. It had become something much larger. Something that would shape not just the outcome of this dispute, but the future direction of the monarchy itself. And just as that realization began to settle in, just as the weight of that confrontation started to ripple through the palace, another development began to unfold. One that would push this situation out of private rooms and into a position where it could no longer be contained. Because when internal pressure reaches a certain level, it does not stay hidden. It starts to leak. It starts to spread. And what happens next would bring this entire conflict closer to the public eye than anyone inside the palace was prepared for. So now the real question is, when something meant to stay behind closed doors begins to surface, who actually controls the narrative? And this is where everything begins to slip beyond control, because the moment internal pressure inside the palace reaches a certain level, it never stays contained. It starts to move, it starts to spread, and most dangerously of all, it starts to find its way into places it was never meant to reach. Because after that confrontation, after Princess Anne made her position unmistakably clear, something shifted in the atmosphere of Buckingham Palace itself. And it was not loud, it was not public, but it was deeply felt by those inside the system. Because for the first time, this was no longer just a disagreement between individuals, it had become a divide within the institution. Now think about that carefully. What happens when a structure built entirely on unity begins to fracture from within? Because insiders began to notice something unusual, something subtle but powerful, where conversations were no longer as controlled, where confidence in internal processes began to weaken, and where the quiet assumption that everything would remain behind closed doors started to feel less certain with each passing day. And this is exactly where the situation takes a dangerous turn. Because once that sense of control begins to fade, information does not stay still. It moves. It leaks. It reshapes the narrative. And suddenly, what was meant to remain private starts to edge closer to becoming visible. So let me ask you this. When the monarchy, an institution built on secrecy and precision, starts to lose control of its own narrative, what does that mean for its stability? Because this is not just about one disagreement anymore. This is about perception. And perception, more than anything else, is what sustains the monarchy. Now here is where the pressure tightens around King Charles III. Because according to those familiar with the situation, his own legal advisors had already reached a conclusion that was difficult to ignore, and even harder to accept, that the position held by Prince Edward was not just strong, it was effectively unchallengeable within the current legal framework. And that creates a moment of quiet but undeniable tension. Because what does a king do when the system he leads tells him there are limits he cannot cross? Does he push forward anyway and risk weakening the structure he depends on, or does he step back and accept a boundary that was set before his reign even began? Now think about how rare that situation actually is. Because monarchs are not used to being told no, especially not by their own system. And yet here, in this moment, that is exactly what had happened. But the pressure did not stop there. Because while Charles was being forced to confront legal reality, Queen Camilla was reportedly continuing to push for consistency, for central control, for a system where every asset, every property, every personal item connected to the monarchy could be reviewed under a unified structure. Now ask yourself this: does consistency strengthen an institution? Or does it risk stripping away the individuality and trust that hold it together? Because in theory, central control sounds efficient. It sounds modern. It sounds necessary. But in practice, especially inside a system built on personal relationships and long-standing traditions, it can feel like something else entirely. It can feel like overreach. And that is exactly where the tension deepens. Because Edward and Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, were not operating in the same way as others inside the royal structure, they had built a level of independence, a level of self-sufficiency that made them harder to influence, harder to reshape, and ultimately harder to bring fully under centralized control. So now the situation begins to look very different. Because what appears on the surface as a policy shift begins to look, from another angle, like an attempt to pull certain individuals back into alignment by challenging the very things that give them independence. And here is the critical question. When independence inside a system becomes a problem, what does that say about the system itself? Because at this point, the palace was no longer unified in its internal response. Staff members, advisors, longtime insiders. Many of them began to quietly align themselves, not publicly, not officially, but in ways that could be felt behind the scenes. Some leaned toward the traditionalist view, supporting the preservation of Queen Elizabeth II's final decisions, while others supported the push for modernization and control. And once those alignments begin to form, the system changes. Because now decisions are no longer made in a vacuum. They are influenced by internal pressure, by quiet support, by unseen resistance. And that is when leaks become inevitable. Because where there are sides, there are voices. And where there are voices, there is movement. Now imagine how dangerous that becomes for an institution like the monarchy, where control over information is everything. Because once internal discussions start moving outward, even subtly, even indirectly, the narrative begins to shift beyond the control of those at the center. So let me ask you this: who truly holds power when the story itself starts to escape the system meant to contain it? Because at this stage, the monarchy was no longer dealing with a contained issue. It was facing a situation where perception, legality, loyalty, and authority were all colliding at the same time. And that kind of collision does not resolve quietly. It forces action. It forces decisions. It forces outcomes that cannot be delayed indefinitely. And this is where Charles reportedly made a move that reveals just how complex his position had become. Because instead of continuing purely through legal or institutional channels, he reached out personally, attempting to shift the situation back into something more familiar, something more manageable. A private conversation, a family discussion, a moment that could potentially de-escalate what had become an increasingly rigid standoff. Now think about that carefully. Because when a king steps away from formal authority and turns to personal communication, it signals something important. It signals that the system alone is no longer enough. But here is where the situation takes another unexpected turn. Because the response he received was not what might have been expected in a traditional royal dynamic. Edward did not agree to a simple private discussion. He did not step into a family conversation without conditions. Instead, he insisted on something that fundamentally changes the nature of the interaction. Legal presence, structured dialogue, protection. Now ask yourself this: what does it mean when a royal no longer approaches a conversation as a family member, but as someone preparing for a negotiation? Because that shift is not small. It is not temporary. It represents a complete change in how trust operates within that relationship. And once that shift happens, it is incredibly difficult to reverse. Because now every interaction carries weight. Every conversation carries risk. Every decision is viewed not just through emotion, but through consequence. And that is exactly where the monarchy finds itself at this moment. Not in open conflict. Not in public crisis, but in something far more complex. A controlled tension. A silent divide. A situation where everything appears stable on the surface, but beneath it, the foundations are being tested in ways that cannot be easily repaired. And as this pressure continues to build, as the legal reality remains unchanged, as the personal dynamics grow more strained, one final step begins to take shape. One that will determine whether this conflict ends quietly, or leaves a permanent mark on the structure of the monarchy itself. Because when the system is forced to respond not just internally, but formally, in a way that cannot be reversed or reinterpreted, everything changes. So now the question becomes, when the palace is finally pushed to put its position into writing, what will it choose to protect, authority or truth? And just when it seemed like this conflict could continue endlessly behind closed doors, the moment arrived that the palace had been trying to delay, because once a decision is written down, once it is formalized, once it becomes part of the official record, there is no quiet way to reverse it, no subtle way to reinterpret it, and no safe way to pretend it never happened. Because late that day, after the legal pressure, after the internal confrontation, and after the growing risk of this situation slipping further into the public eye, a formal communication was issued, short, controlled, and carefully worded, but carrying consequences far greater than its length suggested. And at the center of that outcome stood Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh. Because the message confirmed something that had been under direct challenge, that what had been given to her would remain with her, fully, privately, and without further interference. No reinterpretation, no reclassification, no conditions attached. Now pause for a moment and think about what that really means. Because this was not just about one item. This was a line being drawn. And once that line is drawn in writing, it becomes something much more powerful than a private agreement. It becomes precedent. So let me ask you this. When the palace steps back and confirms a personal ownership claim after challenging it, is that simply resolution? Or is it an admission? Because at the same time, something equally significant was happening in parallel. The pressure surrounding Bagshot Park, the very foundation of this entire conflict, began to disappear, not loudly, not publicly, but in the way the monarchy often handles its most sensitive moments, quietly, efficiently, and without drawing attention to the shift. And yet, everyone inside understood exactly what had taken place. Because the review stopped. The challenge ended. The structure held. And most importantly, the position of Prince Edward remained exactly where it had been placed. Now think about the scale of that outcome. Because this was not a compromise. It was confirmation. Everything that had been questioned now stood reinforced, not just by argument, but by official acknowledgement. And here is where the deeper impact begins to reveal itself. Because once something like this is recorded, it does not disappear with time. It becomes part of the institutional memory. It becomes something future decisions will be measured against. It becomes, whether intended or not, a reference point. So ask yourself this: what happens the next time a similar situation arises? Can the palace challenge another decision in the same way, knowing how this one ended? Or has something fundamentally shifted in how far authority can extend? Because this is where the real consequence lies. Not in the immediate outcome, but in the long-term effect on power. And yet, while the legal and structural battle reached its conclusion, something far more fragile remained unresolved: trust. Because even when disputes are settled on paper, The relationships behind them do not reset. They change. They adapt. And sometimes, they never return to what they once were. Now consider the position of King Charles III. Because on one level, the monarchy remains intact. The structure continues. The public image holds. But beneath that surface, something has shifted in a way that cannot be easily repaired. Because this was not a disagreement handled quietly within the family. This was a moment where one member had to rely on legal certainty to protect himself from the authority of another. And once that happens, the dynamic changes permanently. So let me ask you this. Can a system built on tradition and loyalty function the same way once trust has been replaced by legal boundaries? Because that is the reality this situation leaves behind. And it does not stop there. Because within the monarchy, outcomes like this do not exist in isolation. They create alignments. They reveal positions. They show, even if subtly, where individuals stand when pressure rises. And what has emerged from this moment is something the palace cannot easily undo. Two distinct approaches to the future. On one side, a vision of control, structure, and modernization. On the other, a commitment to continuity, to preserving decisions made before, and to protecting what was already established. And here is the critical question. Can those two approaches coexist without conflict? Because if they cannot, then what we are seeing is not just a single dispute, but the beginning of a longer, deeper shift in how the monarchy operates. Now think about what that means for the next generation. Because figures like James, the future holder of the Edinburgh title, are watching all of this unfold, not as distant observers, but as individuals who will one day step into roles shaped by what is happening right now. And what they are learning is not just tradition. They are learning caution. They are learning that what is given can be questioned. They are learning that preparation matters. And most importantly, they are learning that even inside one of the oldest institutions in the world, nothing is entirely beyond challenge. So what kind of monarchy does that create in the future? One built on trust? Or one built on protection? And as all of this settles, as the documents are filed, as the palace returns to its controlled rhythm, and as public appearances continue to project unity, one truth remains beneath it all. This was not just a quiet internal matter. This was a moment where the limits of authority were tested and defined. And once limits are defined, they do not disappear. They remain. They shape every decision that follows. They influence every move that comes next. So now, as the dust settles and the palace moves forward, the question is no longer about what happened. The question is about what it means. Because if the monarchy cannot fully control everything within its own structure, then where does real power truly lie? And more importantly, what happens the next time someone decides to test those limits again? If you've stayed with this story until now, you already understand that this is far more than a headline, far more than a single dispute, and far more than a passing moment inside the royal family. This is a shift, a signal, a turning point. And I want to hear your perspective. Do you believe this outcome strengthens the monarchy by reinforcing boundaries, or weakens it by exposing internal division? Let me know what you think, because your insight is what keeps conversations like this alive. And if you want more deep, behind-the-scenes analysis like this, make sure you stay connected, because the next story might reveal even more than this one.